I'd like to introduce our next two guests who will be taking to the stage. We're very, very fortunate to have Zelda Perkins with us, who is the founder of the Can't Buy My Silence campaign, born out of her time as the assistant to Harvey Weinstein. And she'll be in conversation with Nadia Beard, who is a journalist, author, and pianist, where they will be discussing breaking the NDA. So please welcome Zelda and Nadia.
Zelda Perkins. So a lot of people will know your name because of Harvey Weinstein. But the reason we're here today is not because of Weinstein, it's because of what happened afterwards. Can you set the scene for your subsequent campaigning work? Take us back to 1998, take us back to 2017. What happened?
Well, I had been working at Miramax for a few years in the UK office, working for Weinstein. And after about 4 or 5 years of working for him, I had my own assistant, and she started just before the Venice Film Festival, and her first meeting with Weinstein was there at the Venice Film Festival, where unfortunately, as we all know from history, he went his usual route and sexually assaulted her. She came and told me, and I immediately did what I thought every other normal 25-year-old would do when their friend or colleague tells them they've been sexually assaulted. I went and confronted Weinstein and reported it. This was clearly quite a naive thing to do, which I was not prepared for. And I removed my colleague from having to spend any time with Weinstein again, and we returned to England and started legal proceedings. I presumed we would have access to justice, that it would be complicated, that we would end up in court, but that justice would be served and hopefully Weinstein would be jailed. Now, most of the trauma of the story people think lies in the sexual assault, but really for both me and my colleague, the larger trauma was discovering that the moment we spoke to lawyers, that even as essentially white, privileged, middle class, well-educated young women, we were told very quickly that we had no access to justice, that it was our word against his, that we needed to be good girls, accept a settlement and toddle off. This was a pretty shocking, this was my first really big shock, and we then went into legal proceedings. It was very clear that this was not a case that could go to court, as had happened in a different legal jurisdiction. And we went through a process that I can only really describe as legal waterboarding. We were two young women under 25, or I was 25. We'd never had any dealings with lawyers. And we ended up going through a negotiation process where we were, on several occasions, kept in the office overnight from 5 in the evening till 5 in the morning. We were not allowed pen and paper. We were not allowed to speak to each other. We were escorted to the toilet. We were made to feel like we were the criminals in a situation where we were trying to highlight a sexual predator. That agreement, in our mind, was the only way to stop Weinstein's behavior, as we weren't given the option as court. So we tried to weaponize that agreement to protect the people that came after us. But we were also very clearly told that the only way to start that process was by negotiating a financial settlement. If we wanted to put in the other clauses that we had suggested to our lawyers, that a financial settlement was how you started. Now, for us, that was already changing the onus of the entire negotiation, because this was never about money. But as we discovered, and as is standard, that is how settlements work. And as we've now discovered, as is standard, confidentiality is woven into these settlements. And without the confidentiality, you're told you won't get the settlement. Now, our settlement was particularly strict in terms of confidentiality. We weren't allowed to speak to the police. We weren't allowed to speak to a lawyer. We weren't allowed to speak to the tax office about our financial settlement. We weren't allowed to speak to our friends, our family, our doctor, therapist, media that had been invented or not yet invented, in perpetuity in the universe and in any other universes that were discovered. So as you can imagine, as two young women, this was an extraordinarily terrifying process to be taken through when we thought ultimately we were doing something normal and right. We were met with a phalanx of men in suits making us feel like we were doing something incredibly wrong.
I mean, it's just outrageous and galling that the legal proceedings were essentially just about giving you money, but not actually putting into place any measures to prevent this from to prevent Harvey from doing something like this again. I mean, did you try to put measures into this agreement?
Yeah, that was how we opened. We said, okay, if our only choice is to have a settlement agreement, a damages agreement, then we have to use this legal tool to stop his behaviour. And actually, at that point, we were dealing with a male senior partner of the company, Simons, Muir, Head and Burton. And I had come up with all of these different things that we needed to ask for, that he couldn't travel with female assistants, that they had to give money to a rape charity, Miramax had to give money to a rape charity, that Harvey had to go to therapy, that if he tried to settle with anybody again, this would be reported to their mother company, which was Disney, or he would be fired. And the senior partner at the law firm told me that these were unreasonable requests and actually gave us a junior lawyer to deal with because he thought we were just wasting time. He didn't want to spend time doing that. And they also, told us a very low settlement amount that we should ask for, which was sort of our statutory claim. And in my naivety, I thought, as it was a legal document, all legal documents would be of public record in some way. I thought, it would be in some sort of legal library somewhere, and if somebody cared to look, they would find this agreement. And even though it doesn't specify what happened, if, the sum of money, the settlement sum, the damages sum, had to be indicative of the crime. So in my mind, this was kind of, the secret kind of weapon of that agreement. And our lawyers very much said, no, you can only get, your statutory claim. And we asked for £250,000, which at that time was a lot of money. It doesn't sound very much now, but it was about as big amount I could think of at the time. And our lawyers vehemently advised us not to ask for this. And they said that Miramax would call our bluff and that we would walk away with no money, no reference, and the ability for Miramax to ruin our careers for the rest of our lives. And I think that was actually the only point where I was genuinely scared, because we weren't allowed to talk to anybody, so I couldn't ring up my family or ask my friends or get any read on whether I was being crazy or not. And I said to the lawyers, no, we have to ask for that amount of money. It has to be indicative of the crime. I don't think you understand how serious this is. And against their advice, they went with that offer, and it was accepted straight away, at which point the lawyers did take us a little more seriously.
So what happened after this? You signed the NDA. What was your life like?
Well, this is really the crux of why sometime later I started the campaign. I think it's very difficult to explain to anybody unless they've been through the experience of being legally or politically silenced. It seems a fair quid pro quo. You get some money, you don't speak about something bad. But this is catastrophic to people's lives on so many levels. It's catastrophic on a psychological, emotional relationship front. When you can't speak to anybody in your life about a huge trauma that may have happened. You can't go to a doctor. You can't go to group therapy.
But you can't go to a doctor to explain why you're having depression, for example.
No, we had in our agreement, it says that if we need to go to a therapist, the therapist would have to sign their own NDA with Miramax before they'd be able to speak to us. So I would have to go to a therapist. I can't talk to you unless you'll sign an agreement with a company whose name I can't tell you until you agree to sign the agreement. So we were in a sort of Kafkaesque bind. I started looking for work again and realised very quickly that this was also impossible, because I only actually went to 2 job interviews. And in both job interviews, which were both with men, unfortunately, and their initial question was, had I been in a relationship with Harvey Weinstein, and if they employed me, was this going to be advantageous or disadvantageous to their company? Now, as a young woman who had just spent a month of her life fighting tooth and nail, not only against a sexual predator, but against the justice system that she had believed would protect her, this was the most infuriating, humiliating experience that could possibly happen. And I realised that there was no way that I was going to be able to go to job interviews and not end up breaking my NDA. The other horror was realising that I was now complicit. I was complicit to the crimes of Weinstein. I was complicit to any further crimes he committed. I couldn't warn anybody. I couldn't protect anybody. And this is what happens to people who get silenced. They don't only get to not own their trauma, to deal with their trauma, but they don't get to warn anybody else, and they get to carry the guilt of potentially allowing a perpetrator to continue abusing people.
And so fast forward 15 years or even more to 2017.
Yeah.
What happened?
Well, it's not so good for the story because I actually wasn't very good at keeping to my NDA. Most people very strictly keep to their NDA. The only way I could really stay out of trouble was in 2000. I moved to Guatemala, which is in Central America, which is about as far away from the UK and US film industry that you can get. So, you know, nobody cared nobody was interested in my past career, and it meant that I could kind of live freely because I couldn't operate at home, because I couldn't speak to anybody. And so on several, I broke my NDA quite regularly, but obviously completely ineffectually over that period of time. In 2013, I was back in the UK and I was producing theatre, and I was approached by the journalist Ken Arletta at The New Yorker, who had tracked me down in Guatemala, but I'd not spoken to him then. He tracked me down in 2013 when there was a case with an Italian model in New York, and if anybody's seen the movie, She Said, there is actually the real footage of Weinstein and Amber. She went and reported a sexual assault from him, and the NYPD sent her back in with a wire. And this story was happening, and I happened to be in New York, and Ken Arletta approached me, and so I told him everything. In 2013, I completely broke my NDA. I told him everything because I thought, well, the New York police have got it on tape. Here's Harvey attempting to assault another woman, admitting to having done it before. We're here, we're done. And Arletta wrote up the story, went to Weinstein for right to reply, and the next day the tape was disappeared. Amber was paid over $1 million in a settlement, and no judgment there at all. I don't blame her. Her life was ruined anyway, even after the settlement. And the New Yorker couldn't print the story. But the story obviously was beginning to gain more momentum behind closed doors. And then in 2017, Jodie Cantor from the New York Times rang me out of the blue at home. And it's the first time a female journalist had rung me, and this is actually quite significant because she approached it in a very different manner. Ken Arletta's first question to me also was, how long was your affair with Harvey? You may laugh. It's a tough thing to hear when you've fought really hard against, a predator like that. But Jodie rang and said, I don't want to ask you anything, I just want to tell you some things. And it was clear from what she told me that people in power were beginning to speak, people who might be listened to. Because I had tried on several occasions, Ken Arletta wasn't the only one in 2013, but I had tried on several occasions with journalists to open this story, but it was always killed. And the reality of my voice being heard over Weinstein's was zero. And so in a way, I think the planets aligned. This was not about a moment of bravery or anything special other than the planets aligned. The right people started talking. When that first story was published in the New York Times, I actually was really disappointed because it had so little of what information I told them, but they couldn't publish it because they were trying to legally protect me. But again, the law stood in the way of the truth being told. And in fact, one of the only reasons that the story was able to be published was because I had managed to get a few pages of my agreement, which I then had given to the New York Times. So one of the other clauses in our non-disclosure agreement was we weren't allowed to hold a copy of it. So for the 20 years that I had been silent, I didn't even have the agreement to check what I could or couldn't do, because even having that document was too risky.
What you were talking about, silencing, it's so interesting, and it's actually a theme that's come up in several sessions today about finding one's voice and the fundamental importance of expression and self-expression of all different kinds to kind of well-being and feeling like a human that can actually flourish. And you started Can't Buy My Silence. How difficult was it for you to start it? Was it that once you sort of put your hand up, you found other people to join your movement? Where did you find allies across institutions?
Well, it was quite a solitary journey at the beginning. I presumed when I broke my NDA that lots of other women would break their NDAs because they'd see that the sky hadn't fallen in. There were no legal repercussions for me. I mean, there could have been, but there weren't, because I had the protection, essentially, of the enormous amount of brave women who were coming forward about Weinstein in the Me Too movement. And that first 4 years, I basically was fighting my own battle, but it wasn't for my own personal revenge. It was that it was very clear to me that people understood that this wasn't about a bad individual. This was about a systemic problem. And in some ways, Harvey was also a victim of that system, because he was a man in power who could buy justice, who everybody fell around with sycophancy. You know, celebrity, fame and power, we become ridiculous sycophants around. And his behavior was enabled, it was approved of, it was allowed, not just by the industry around him, but more disturbingly, by a legal system that was meant to protect us. And to me, this was the crux of the whole matter. Putting Harvey in jail was important, but it wasn't going to solve the problem. It wasn't going to stop these things continuing to happen. You know, we have law to protect ourselves from ourselves. Humans are dark and light, and it does seem that those in power err towards darkness. And but you can't change human nature, you can change the law. And I felt that it was really important that in the noise and hysteria of the kind of Weinstein story, that people didn't lose focus, or that it was highlighted where the real root of the problem was. So initially I was really trying to bring this to the British Parliament and to the British legal system. And I thought I would show it to them and then they would go, oh, how terrible, and deal with it. My naivety again. But I was fortunate enough to give evidence at a couple of select committee inquiries, and at the time, the Prime Minister was Theresa May, and she took this very seriously. And it looked like in 3 years, this was a problem that was going to be dealt with. But then we had a leadership change, and we got a Prime Minister called Boris Johnson, who transparency was not high on his list of concerns. And then COVID-19 hit. And all of the momentum and work that really had happened in that 4 years on my own completely fell away. Yeah. During COVID, I started meeting a lot of people on social media who really highlighted to me that this was not just a problem of the rich and famous. This was an endemic problem in every sector, and actually in many ways worse in lower income, more vulnerable workers, for more vulnerable workers.
But what do you mean? So NDAs exist and are used across every sector?
NDAs exist everywhere, in the charity sector, in the ecclesiastical sector, in the business sector, in the hospitality sector, in the private sector, wherever you look. It has become standardized. Doesn't mean that most NDAs wouldn't ever hold up in court, and this is kind of the awful irony of an NDA, is that all of the fear is preloaded. It's the legalese, the threat, the aggression in the negotiation. You can put anything you want into a private legal contract. You could say anything. You could say, "We'll kill your cat if you tell somebody about this," or because the whole point of an NDA is nobody ever gets to see it. It's secret. So you can write whatever you want in it. You can put a fear of God into anybody. The reality is that most NDAs, if you took them to court, would not hold up in court. So the root of the law is correct, but in practice, it was being used unethically and immorally. And the only way to change that was by changing legal sector guidance and attitude and practice, and by changing legislation. And so in 2019, I started a public-facing campaign, which is called Can't Buy My Silence, with the partnership of a Canadian law professor. And I started really in earnest lobbying in Parliament and in the legal sector. And this, I suppose, was, I'd been sort of at this for 5 years, and my energy was pretty low. But having got to the point of completely losing my anonymity and highlighting a problem and having that problem confirmed back to me that this was wrong. Everybody was horrified, it seemed, yet nobody was really doing anything. And it felt like there was no way that I could stop until we reached the goal. And I don't think I ever really thought about the possibility of that goal not being achieved.
I know that we have a lot of campaigners and activists and engaged citizens in the audience, and Georgia is, of course, a very different context to the UK. But you have had a successful campaign and you have changed the laws. What have you learned from that experience?
It's given me a lot of faith back in human nature. It's also taught me that integrity and resilience are really the most important ingredients to succeeding with a campaign. I wouldn't necessarily advise it for anybody. It's not much fun. It's really hard work, but it also has been more fulfilling for me. And personally, I feel very privileged to have been able to turn what was an incredibly negative and life-destroying, completely life-destroying experience into a positive experience. It's taken much longer than I ever anticipated. It's really been nearly 9 years. But what has been I think the biggest privilege of my life, and I know I can only speak for my experience in the UK, but to live in a democracy and to see that it does work. You know, the levers are rusty, the buttons are sticky. There's a whole load of rubbish and shit that goes on around it. But if you are working for the greater good, not for your own personal gain, if you can speak to the politicians, you know, that are available to you, the majority of them in the UK are there to serve the people. They do work for us. And that was a revelation to me. It never occurred to me. I'd always sat around and moaned like everybody else does. But to have the experience of seeing that process does work, those two chambers, the checks and balances do work. If you continue to push, if you continue to show up, you can make a change. You can make things happen. And the privilege of that is so extraordinary for a woman in this environment where there is so much changing. I had no political experience, no legal experience, no campaigning experience, no strategy experience. And just knowing that this was the right thing. And when I think you're fighting for rights, it essentially, you will get there.
Listening to you talk, I mean, there's just so much new information. I've never signed an NDA and frankly had no idea really what was in them. Is there something around the narrative around, we're not talking about it. It's not really a conversation that is had in the media. People aren't talking about it. It's just not something that we really acknowledge unless you unfortunately have first-hand experience of it. Have you noticed in the last 20 years that the conversation around abusive NDAs has changed and that there's some shift in the narrative?
Not in the last 20, in the last 10. Yeah, I mean, when I first started talking about NDAs, nobody really knew about them. Nobody was particularly interested in them. The media wasn't even that clued in. And I have to say, the media has played an extraordinary and incredibly powerful part in this entire process. I saw them as the enemy at the beginning. I was absolutely terrified of speaking to the press. I was constantly waiting for the press to turn on me. But in fact, the press, the media, have completely, given fuel to this campaign, because working with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 very good journalists who got the story, understood the insidious and harmful nature of silence being used and being used in such a endemic way, meant that they started to look for NDAs. And honestly, after about 3 years of speaking about non-disclosure agreements, there was a tip in how things were being reported in the press, which meant that I had a very easy time as a campaigner, because journalists started looking for NDAs. And every scandal, whether it was, a TV personality who had been sexually inappropriate, whether it was the post office and the Fujitsu scandal, whether it was Al Fayed, every single scandal, every single thing that they were reporting on, what did they find at the root of all of this was an NDA. An NDA hiding harm, hiding crime. And, this is completely unethical and immoral. And actually, the enemy became silence rather than an individual or an institution. And I think that's also what kind of meant that I was slightly protected, because I was never going after an individual or an institution. I was going after a system and an ethical issue.
I want to open up to questions. I think there'll be a roving mic. Do we have questions? Yes, we have one in the front here. Is there a mic somewhere? We have a question at the front.
There's a mic over there.
Mm-hmm. And cut.
Hi, thank you so much once more for all your work that you've been doing for the last 20 years and coming today and sharing your story more subjectively to us as well is so important. And I just have a question that as a young woman who is just stepping into that industry, unfortunately, I've been told by the representatives of the industry that as a second-year student, I need to get used to the reality that sexual assault is the reality of this industry, and I need to just accept it. And in the world where I'm sure not only me, but tons of other women are just being put into that situation, that it's either acceptance or there's nothing more to it, what advice or a few strengthening words could you say to us that kind of would put things into perspective of, yeah, the future doesn't hold that necessarily?
You don't have to accept that. You absolutely don't have to accept that, and you can challenge them absolutely with total power. I don't know which part of the industry you're entering into or who told you that, but I can certainly tell you that in the mainstream there is a huge amount of change. Of course it's not perfect. It's not perfect in any industry, but I actually think that the creative industries are way ahead of most other sectors at the moment. And the whole point of this is to not accept it. And the more of you that don't accept it, there is no acceptance. There is absolutely no acceptance. Genuinely. I mean, I'm completely flabbergasted that anybody's even said that to you. But I can tell you, you have power to say that they're completely wrong and that they're living in the past, and good luck to them.
Thank you so much. You truly are a role model to me, and I believe tons of other women and younger women out there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Naya, there's a question here also.
First of all, a tremendous effort, fantastic result, and well done you. It's really, really needed. On the other hand, my question may be a little bit kind of philosophical rather than practical. Having signed gagging order, so to speak, myself in London, and being familiar with various organizations that not necessarily sexual harassment, but there are lots of other emotional abuses and other ways of discrimination and harassment. Do you think, and being a law student myself and familiar with courts, do you think the legal framework ever can protect us for not maybe from most hideous ways of sexual abuse or something, but low-level abuse that is rife in organizations what we least expect, like schools, for example, among the staff, etc. Do you think it's possible that law can be effective and trade unions are not at all useful? I can tell you that from my own experience.
It's never going to completely eradicate bad behaviour, but it absolutely can change the culture, and the legal frameworks are really important. With the legislation that we've just passed in the UK, in the Employment Rights Act, it is now any confidentiality clause, and that includes non-disparagement, is void if it is trying to hide any form of harassment or discrimination or bullying. So that's pretty broad. Of course, it's not perfect, and if you're legally trained, you'll know that the law is like water and it will always find a way around these things. But I do believe that legislation and law structure is at the root of supporting cultural change. It is that root that we need. And, you know, the amount of conversations and work that is now going on in the corporate environment and in smaller business environment is completely changed in the last 10 years. And again, I'm not saying it's perfect, it's not there yet, but the fact that there is now a duty on employers, and again, I can only really talk about the UK, but there is a duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment. And that also is in terms of third parties. So if you're a waitress and you work in a restaurant and you are sexually harassed by one of the restaurant's clients, that is the responsibility of your boss now, your employer. So, you know, these are legal structures that are changing and will change the structure, because I can tell you, if employers are going to end up being fined or losing more money in tribunals because they haven't protected their staff, they are going to change the way the work environment is set up.
Any more questions? Okay, while you think about that, I have one more question. I was talking about something completely different earlier today about playing the piano, and I sort of have a question for you about stamina, because I was also thinking earlier today about what it takes to commit to something, really commit yourself to it, believe in it, because it's long and it's really difficult to do it. Where do you find stamina from? How are you sort of, what undergirds your like determination over several years to achieve something?
Yeah. Well, I'd love to say that I was, consistently being brilliant and determined, but I spent a lot of time sobbing on the floor, I can tell you. But for me, I have to say it's nature. I live in the countryside. I have horses and sheep and chickens, and there is nothing like picking up animal poo every day to bring you back down to earth, remind you what's important, and the kind of, without sounding too woo-woo, the love and support of non-judgmental beings, i.e. animals, is more powerful than anything else. My friends and family have done their best, but I think when you're on a difficult path, often your friends and family's agenda is to protect you, not maybe support you in something that they think is going to potentially damage you. So I think you have to dig very deep in yourself, and you have to find the things that support you. But I think for me, really, my one core belief was that I knew that I was doing the right thing, or I believed I was doing the right thing. And there was still that optimism in me that believed that if you do the right thing, in the end, life pays out. And I think after having spent nearly 30 years completely disillusioned with so much, I couldn't afford to let this go. I couldn't afford to fail at this. And it taught me a lot about strength and resilience, and actually that having a little bit of jeopardy and challenge is what makes you stronger.
Any more questions in the meantime? Okay, oh wow, look, 4. Who has the mic? Yeah, if you can come up here to the lady in the dress.
Hi, thank you so much for being here and sharing your experience. You referenced the journalists who asked you insensitive and inaccurate questions and how that was different from Jodi Kantor's approach. What would you say to journalists and reporters? What should they know about covering survivors of sexual assault and how they work? What are some of the lessons learned that you experienced or you saw the media not do well?
I didn't hear the last part. You were asking what advice for journalists covering survivors of sexual assault?
Yes. So what are some lessons learned that you've experienced in terms of what is good coverage and good journalism that takes into account the trauma and the experience of survivors?
It's very difficult. I think anybody who speaks up, whether it's about sexual assault or any whistleblowing, it's a very hard arena to step into. It's never an easy ride, and I think the journalists tend to be your first port of call. And the most important thing, I guess, is that they believe you, that they hear you, and that they give you continued support. And I know that's a hard one for journalists because, when you take a story, you put the work in to get the story and then you move on. But when you're dealing with very psychologically vulnerable sources, actually giving that pastoral continued support is possibly the most important thing. And I think not raising people's expectations and being very clear to them how damaging speaking up in the public domain can be. because once your story is out, you can never take it back. It grows legs and it runs away from you like a child, and it develops its own life, and you have no control over that story. And if I was a journalist, I would have to very clearly have an ethical line of understanding of whether somebody was too vulnerable or not to share their story publicly.
And I think there's somebody at the back.
Hi, thank you. I just wondered, in terms of uncovering the scope of the problem, what methods are available for journalists to find NDAs, to find out how many have been signed? I'm guessing there's no database. Is it all secret? Is it all word of mouth?
It's incredibly difficult, and this has been the power of the NDA. To be honest, the only way that you can find out about NDAs is if you find people who are willing to break them, and that's very hard. I mean, in the 8 years since I broke mine, I have worked alongside several people who have broken their NDA, but I can count that on one hand. And every single one of those people who's broken an NDA, that they have not received, there's not been any legal recrimination, and actually the perpetrator has either been brought to justice or has certainly been exposed. But the fear behind breaking NDAs is still so enormous, and I think that's clear from a small number of people who are breaking their NDAs. So as a journalist, it's about building trust with victims. Again, with the legislation that we're developing in the UK, we're hoping that part of that will be that all companies have to register every single non-disclosure agreement that they make. And when I talk about that, that's only a non-disclosure agreement, because the new legislation means it can't be a non-disclosure agreement hiding discrimination or harassment. But there's still going to be misconduct and issues that are being hidden by confidentiality or ways round. But if companies have to legally register every NDA, I think that will be something that, Freedom of Information Act, Freedom of Information investigations can rise. I mean, certainly the BBC did a 3-year study on higher education institutions in the UK, which was part of the data that led to our first piece of legislative change, where they discovered that higher education institutions in the UK over a 3-year period had spent over £90 million on secret settlements. Now, I'm not saying all of those were around misconduct or sexual harassment. Some of those would have been legitimate NDAs. And that's another thing that we haven't covered. I mean, NDAs are completely and utterly legitimate when used for the right purpose. IP needs to be protected. Private information needs to be protected. What you cannot do is weaponize it and make assault intellectual property.
More questions? I think someone had a hand up in the middle. Are you putting your hand up? Okay, we have somebody at the front.
Thank you for this fascinating story, and thank you for the work that you have done. It's a tremendous work, and it's highly appreciated. I have this kind of question. And during this long journey that you had, you say that it's 20 years, right? So do you recall any situation where there was a single woman from different systems, not specifying, who has supported your journey, your fight?
Yes, there have been many women who've supported my fight. Within the legal sector, interestingly, even from from a human rights chamber, and I think we have a lawyer from there today, Doughty Street. So Baroness Helena Kennedy has been an incredible support from day one, and was key for me to really understanding how to navigate my way through the legal sector. Also, an extraordinary number of female politicians, I have to say, all of them female. There were a couple of male politicians who lent their ear to the issue, but not their shoulder. But it has been a combination of different women and female journalists as well, who have really held me up and helped me continue the journey.
Any more questions?
Tan.
Do we have time for one more question? Okay, one last question. Oh, somebody's over there, waving her hands in the air.
Hi, Deborah Wild. Thank you very much, and thanks for all the work you have done. If I understood you correctly, you are saying that the repercussions, that legal repercussions for breaking an NDA agreement are less real than the repercussions you might suffer by telling your story to the media. And my second question, sorry if I make two out of them. It's been recently said, I've seen articles that say that the achievements of the Me Too movement have either been reversed or faded away. And I would like to know if you agree that that is true, or do you think something fundamentally has changed? And what is that?
So your first question, every single non-disclosure agreement or settlement agreement is individual and unique, and I cannot give a blanket answer to that. The majority of NDAs that I have seen would not hold up in court. However, you have to have the finances, the emotional and psychological ability to take that to court. And if you're fighting somebody powerful with a lot of money, that may destroy you along the way. But the reality is that the majority of them would not be legally enforceable. When I talk to people who are considering breaking their NDA, that's exactly the question I really ask them, is for them, would it cause them more emotional and psychological damage to continue to stay silent, or to take the risks of what will come if they break their NDA publicly? Now, the reality is also with the environment change, and the environment has completely changed, is that, so one of the first women that I worked with who broke her NDA, she broke it with a transport union in the UK. Nothing glamorous. But she recorded her testimony on a YouTube channel, and the transport union tried to super-injunct the YouTube platform, the platform, to get it taken down. And the judge threw it out because he said, she's talking about sexual assault. You know, this is a crime. So, and she's already spoken about it now, and she's, so the NDA is, the confidentiality is invalid. And the reality is that the risk equation has changed for those in power who've used NDAs now. If a victim breaks their NDA, first of all, that information is now out in the public domain. So are you not going to look worse if you then go after the victim of some form of crime or abuse? You then try and go after them publicly. And so a lot of tactics now, and I don't know if anybody here is a Neil Gaiman fan or has followed the Neil Gaiman issue. Neil Gaiman had a lot of NDAs with women, and several women broke them. And his initial response to that was just to keep quiet, which actually was quite a sensible response, but a new response, because he felt if I keep quiet, it'll just go away, rather than going after the victims. He hasn't gone after any of the victims because he doesn't have a leg to stand on. I think your second question was asking about whether Me Too had an effect or not. This is a question I get asked a lot. And again, I'm sorry, I'm not man-bashing, I promise, but it is the patriarchal narrative. It is absolutely not true. Look at the conversations that we're having, look at the language, look at the dialogue, look at what's happening within every company. It doesn't mean that it's stopped. It doesn't mean that people aren't still behaving badly, but the conversations that are being had, the new policies that are being written, look at the women who are coming forward. If Me Too had failed, Giselle Pellicot would not have been lauded as a heroine. 10 years ago, she would have been an embarrassment. Nobody would have wanted to know. The environment has totally changed, but sociocultural change takes a really long time. The pendulum is swinging wildly around. Me Too hasn't failed. Me Too is still happening. It's about equality. Equality takes time and it moves up and down. But right now, there is a huge amount happening. A huge amount has changed. And the fact that the overriding dialogue is that it has failed only shows how much it is succeeding.
I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very much, Zelda.